Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning. Let's give it a couple of minutes right up at the top as people gather. Okay, fantastic. We're up to that, Sony folk. Let's get going. Good morning, good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to have you join us uh, for this session. A very warm welcome to you all. My name is Darshan Wignaraj. I'm the director at CPI who leads on our tracking work. I'm delighted to open the third and final session in our series, Global Climate Finance in Focus, Frameworks, Flows and Foundations. And this third webinar is very much focused on the foundations element. Today we'll take a look into the engine room behind one of CPI's most recognized global publications. Below this, we'll look at the methodology that underpins the global landscape of climate finance, the 2025 report, and by extension, many of our related reports and collaborations which draw on the data that the global landscape, or GLCF, pulls together. It also underpins many of the collaborations we have with some of our key partners. Methodology and approach is critical at this time. It's crucial because it sits below the ability for those who use our data to make sensible and effective comparisons from it. And it underpins the trust and credibility that policymakers, those who make investment decisions, have in this data that we synthesize and draw together. As I'm sure you're all very aware, there is more and more data coming online as we speak, and there's a real premium on how to make sense of it. What is good and helpful in insights? How can vastly different and dispersed data sets be harmonized and brought together and compared in a way that makes the information contained within helpful for those who are navigating it? And the task continues to get more and more complex, but there's obviously an upside that as the data availability improves, the quality of coverage, the reach, and the level of granularity also can improve. There are obviously significant gaps still in the climate finance space. The headline synthesized figures in the landscapes that we produce are the result of a huge amount of meticulous work by a team of more than 30 people across our 7 office locations, ensuring that hundreds of thousands of data points are collected, checked, and validated, and that our data sources are brought into, as I said, a consistent and comparable format. The methodology, I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear, has evolved greatly over the years that we have been producing our products, which is in excess of 10 years. And will, I anticipate, continue to evolve to meet the growing scale and complexity of the climate transition challenge. I think COP30, which recently finished in Brazil, emphasized again just how crucial transparent, insightful, and trusted data products are for aligning with global climate and development goals. Our insights bring this clarity, credibility, and consistency, which enables decision makers, governments, ministries, investors, financial institutions, both of public and private complexions, to navigate uncertainty and act with a degree of confidence. I'm very pleased today that our team has the chance to show you how we build that foundation. Presently, our fantastic tracking lead, Bison Naran, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is currently out on maternity leave. But we have a talented array of team leads to take you behind the scenes of the landscape. You're going to hear from Sasha, Pedro, Varun, and Jake, all of whom lead elements of our work in this space. I'll finish by saying, look, I encourage you to ask questions throughout the session. I think the best way to do that is to drop them in the Q&A box at the bottom or the side of your screen. We will monitor that as they come in, and we'll endeavour to address as many as possible during the different sections in the presentation and potentially at the end of the elements that we're going to talk you through. Finally, I'll highlight that this webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website, the CPI website, in coming days, along with all of the slides that we're going to present to you. I think those are the key things I wanted to cover. Sasha, I can see you beaming at me. I'm going to hand across to you to start taking us through.
Thanks so much, Nash. And Anna, if you could flick to the first slide for me. And one after that. Thanks so much. So, hi everyone. Thanks for attending our webinar. As you know, today my colleagues and I will take you through the methodology behind the global landscape of climate finance, which is CPI's most read report, and it's also the leading figure for global climate finance flows in their entirety. So Varun, Pedro, Jake, and I all work directly on producing the global landscape each year, and we're going to talk you through some of the practical steps and considerations we take when we're doing this work. So today we'll first cover the context for the global landscape and why we think it's important that climate finance is monitored and tracked and analysed. We'll also then go into how CPI produces the numbers in the data set, looking at the various steps we take to scope the data, collect it, and process it. As part of this, we're then going to talk through the analytical frameworks and validation techniques that we use to make sure that our data and insights are high quality and reliable. And then we'll talk briefly about how the data is used and what our next steps are for further improving the global landscape methodology. We go to the next slide, please, Jana. So I think when we're talking about the global landscape, it's only right that we start with the graphic that we're best known for, which is our Sankey or spaghetti diagram. And this iconic graphic starts with our headline figure here, 1.9 trillion in climate finance flows across public, private, all sources in 2023, but then it also dives into a lot of detail underneath that. It looks at where the climate finance comes from, where it goes, and what form it's provided in. As you can imagine, it takes a huge amount of work and expertise to come up with this number and for it to be robust. And we first want to go through why we think that effort is worth it and what value this wider exercise has in the world and in climate action more generally. And if we could go to the next slide, please, Jana. So first, why do we think it's important to put this number on climate finance? So it helps us understand where we are. I think a lot of the news on climate finance is often talking about large numbers on how much investment is needed in a certain year, potentially quite far away, or how much finance world leaders have pledged to give in the next decade or so. And I think that can be really hard to understand if we don't have reliable data on where we are now to contextualize it, and also data on how quickly climate finance has been able to grow in previous years to help understand what might be possible in the future and how we might be able to go quicker. Getting that headline number is part of the puzzle. Once we have that, we also want to know some of the detail underneath it on the providers and the recipients, the regions and instruments, so that we can then start to map out the building blocks of how the climate investment gaps can be filled. I think a mantra that we have at CPI is that you can't manage what you can't measure. And that's some of the driving force about why we try to track everything so comprehensively. And if we can go to the next slide, please, Jana. Yeah, I think when we look at the Sankey and if we look at where we are now in climate finance, it's always helpful to remember that we haven't always been in that position. Even 10, 15 years ago, not very much of this was happening. It was much harder to do. So this quote here is looking at where we were in 2012, for example, and when the 100 billion commitment was first agreed in 2009, there weren't established definitions of what climate finance is. There weren't readily available climate data sources. There weren't agreed on methodologies. And we've come very far in the past 15 years. I think it's useful to mention that this is part of why CPI was first formed, that our founders spotted a gap. They knew that the investment needed to finance the climate transition would require a comprehensive and reliable evidence base on climate finance flows, and that's very much what we are always trying to provide. Since then, there's been a lot of progress. Climate finance tracking, analysis, data provision has come on in leaps and bounds, but there's still a lot more to do, and it's something that we're constantly evolving and building on. In the webinar, our colleagues will take you through the methodologies and frameworks that we've built at CPI over that time, and really how we've contributed to the progress that we've seen over those last 15 years, and yeah, how we're able to produce such comprehensive figures now. I'm going to hand over to Varun, who can then talk us through how we define and categorize climate finance and how that impacts the data that goes into the global landscape.
Thank you, Sasha, for the introduction. I want to start here by saying that there's no single universal definition of climate finance. However, I'll spend the next few slides running through how we define and track climate finance at CPI. Next slide, please. So what is climate finance? I think different organizations emphasize different areas or different focuses of climate finance. For example, some focus mainly on international flows from the global north to the global south. For tracking climate finance flows globally, CPI's working definition aligns with the latest operational definition of the UNFCCC Standing Committee on Finance. In short, we understand climate finance as flows of funds to activities, programs, or projects that are intended to help address climate change. It also covers finance for actions identified in countries' nationally determined contributions, adaptation communications, national adaptation plans, and long-term emission reduction strategies. It's important to note here that although there's an overlap, not all sustainable or green investments are considered as climate finance. Sustainable finance is the broadest concept. It takes into consideration environmental, social, and governance into investment decisions, whereas green finance focuses on environmental considerations but does not always guarantee positive mitigation or adaptation outcomes. For example, the IDFC treats green finance as an umbrella term that includes climate finance, biodiversity finance, and other environmental objectives. Here you can see identified in red is climate finance. Next slide, please. So CPI's working definition of climate finance consists of three elements. Firstly, we have mitigation finance, which refers to the resources directed to activities that contribute to reducing or avoiding greenhouse gas emissions. And an easy example of this is offshore wind energy investment in renewable energy. Next, we have adaptation finance, which covers resources directed towards activities aimed at reducing the vulnerability of human or natural systems to climate change. An example of this would be developing early warning systems for riverine flooding. And finally, we have dual benefit finance, which is directed towards activities that simultaneously meet the criteria of both mitigation and adaptation. An example would be an afforestation project that also helps prevent slope erosion. So this brings significant adaptation benefits whilst also contributing to climate mitigation. And these three added up would be what we constitute as total climate finance. Next slide, please. So now that we have the definition, I'll briefly walk you through the framework that we use to track climate finance. For each of these pillars, we apply a taxonomy, which is a standardized classification system that groups activities and actors according to how they address climate change. And you can find more details about this in our methodology. First, the sources of finance. So flows are classified as domestic, where finance is raised and spent within the same country. International, when it's raised in one country and spent in another, and intermediate, when the distribution across countries or regions is unclear. And as CPI only focuses on real economy investments, we have not yet included indirect financing, but we are looking into that. Second, we have actors that provide the climate finance. We distinguish public actors, which are in blue, and private actors, which are in orange. Public actors include national governments, multilateral and bilateral development financial institutions, whereas private actors would include corporations or commercial financial institutions. A key aim of our work is to track private flows to the same standard and quality that we would track public finance flows. Next, we have instruments that are used by these actors to channel the climate finance. So we capture project level, and for example, we capture project level finance that may be debt. We also look at balance sheet financing that could be debt or equity, and we also look at concessional financing such as grants. We recognize the importance of risk management instruments such as guarantees and insurance for channeling climate finance, which can be quite catalytic, but we do not yet include their values in the total climate finance flows because the actual outflows are conditional and uncertain. Next, we have the sectors that the climate finance is directed towards. And here we want to highlight that CPI is unique in the fact that it provides full coverage of all sectors, whereas many other institutions focus either, like, for example, on energy and transport or buildings and industry or agriculture or some other sector, but we cover a wide spectrum. Diving a bit deeper into the sectoral taxonomy, I want to highlight that within each sector, we map a range of solutions, and each of those solutions are assigned to a subsector, and that's also tagged for its climate relevance, whether it's mitigation or adaptation, and this exists for each of the sectors. Here's an example of the energy system sector where you have your sector, subsector, and a range of solutions. Here, I also want to highlight that there are exclusions that we have, and this is because we take a conservative approach to avoid solutions that might have carbon lock-in. For example, if there's carbon capture use and storage that is counted, it's only counted when the projects are clearly indicative of 100% carbon removal capacity, or if it's an energy investment project, we only include it when it's applied to clean energy assets. This conservative treatment is one of the reasons that you may see CPI numbers differ from some of the other values that you may be familiar with. Next slide, please. So returning to the framework, next is the regions. We allocate every project to a region following the groupings shown here and the detailed country list you can find in our methodology. These regional definitions evolve over time, and an example of that is that we are planning to introduce Southeast Asia as one of the regions. Finally, we have the development status. And since 2024, we've been assigning this based on the IMF and UN classifications, and we distinguish it based on advanced economies, emerging market and developing economies, and least developed economies. And we've been trying to use this also to support some of the reports that we write, such as the EMDE Spotlight that was published earlier this year. For every project, we assign a source, actor, instrument, sector, region, and development status according to this framework. And what you see here is a simplified view of a much more detailed methodology. Next slide, please. I'll run you through a project example. So for each project in our database, for example, this is a solar PV project that you'll see on the slide. We extract the source of finance, which in this case would be a domestic source. Because it's a domestic actor. They're a private corporation, and they've used balance sheet financing through the equity portion to finance this solar PV project. We look at the sector, subsector, and solution. So the solution is solar PV, and the subsector is power and heat generation within the energy system sector. The project takes place in India, so India and South Asia, and it's an emerging market. So this is the level of detail we go into. And often the project size is higher than the amount that we record for a single actor instrument. And when multiple financiers are involved, with like part equity and part loan, we aim to capture each component separately so it sums up to the total project finance. Next slide, please. This is a second example of how we apply the same logic, but for a very different project. So this is a public finance project, and it's a supplementary loan provided by an export credit agency. So here the sources are international finance because it comes from an international actor to Cambodia, so from Korea to Cambodia. And it comes through concessional means, and it's under the water and wastewater sector. So these are just two small examples from a much larger data gathering exercise that we conduct each year before standardizing and analyzing the data. And I'll hand over to my colleague Pedro, who will walk you through the data collection process in more detail.
Thank you, Varun, and good morning and evening to everyone attending. So since we just saw how to categorize our data and saw some examples of how it's done, let's now see exactly in which data sources we use this framework just presented, and what's the approach to synthesize all these data sources into a single centralized global landscape data set. First, let's look at our GLCF historic updates on the next slide. The timeline you're seeing right now reflects an ongoing process of refinement, so rather than isolated upgrades. So every year we review our methodology with the same goal, to make the global landscape of climate finance more accurate, comprehensive, and transparent. And our approach is evidence-driven. As new information becomes available, new data sources emerge, our sectoral definitions evolve, and we adapt our methods to ensure our tracking stays aligned with the real world. And the key message here is that our methodology is not static, right? It evolves as climate finance evolves, and that ongoing refinement is what strengthens the credibility of the findings year after year. On the next slide, you can see that we don't rely on a single data set. Over time, this continuous improvement that I just saw has led to us building a much richer data ecosystem. Today, the latest GLCF, the latest global landscape, where we did our MD spotlight, published a month ago, it draws from around 30 different data sources, from public available databases and institutional surveys and also project level data sets and proprietary sources. At the top of the image, you can see the CPI logo, which you can see that our analysis incorporates insights from more than 37 surveys conducted with DFIs, which provide critical data on their investments and enable a detailed understanding of finance patterns that are often not captured in public data sets, and provide either an extended coverage or more granularity to this type of investments. So using these multiple sources, it allows us to cross-validate data and to strengthen the reliability of our centralized data set. And it also helps ensure that no major flows are overlooked, providing a more complete picture of the global climate finance landscape. At the same time, we synthesize definitions and methodologies across these sources, and we carefully account for potential overlaps to avoid double counting, especially with multilateral flows that can appear in multiple data sets or flows covering the same sectors. So on the next slide, so given the wide range of sources that we draw onto the global landscape, it's essential to follow a clear tracking principles to ensure the quality and consistency and reliability of the data we use. So our 8 principles guide how we collect, process, and report climate finance flows by helping us navigate differences in definitions, coverage, and methodologies across sources. The first principle regards the tracking of real economy investments. So the GLCF captures total primary financial transactions and investment costs, or components of activities that directly contribute to adaptation and or mitigation, along with the public framework and capacity development expenditures for enabling these efforts. This also means that secondary market transactions, such as the resale of stakes or public trading on financial markets, are not tracked, as they do not represent new investments targeting climate-specific outcomes, but rather money exchanged for existing assets. On the second principle, the figures reported in the GLCF represent financial commitments made during the tracking period. So given that committed amounts are frequently disbursed over multiple years and may be delayed, increased, reduced, or canceled altogether in response to shifting geopolitical circumstances, commitment information offers a more consistent and accurate reflection of the financial resources being directed towards climate action in any given year. Also adding to the challenge, consistent data on disbursements is also unobtainable across multiple sectors and across multiple regions. Next, we benchmark against reputable data sources. So we benchmark our numbers against data from the most authoritative institutions, sense checking our figures to align with globally recognized standards and projections. And this approach maintains the credibility and accuracy of our analysis, particularly in sectors where reliable project level data is limited. Fourth, we avoid double counting. So CPI, as you saw, CPI gathers data from numerous sources, right? So often this results in the same flow being recorded several times. So we apply different methods and employ those methods to identify and eliminate those double counted entries. The last four principles are more self-explanatory, so I will not go as deep, but the first one, the fifth one, referring to being conservative when unsure to include data or not. Not tracking carbon lock-in, which is correlated with our exclusion criteria referred in the last section. Complying with data confidentiality agreements. And last, maximize flows granularity, which means that if two data sources report the same investment for a single institution, we will choose one that has the highest granularity, at the project level. And these last ones directly correlate with the next slide. So building on the tracking principles we just discussed, one of the key ways we ensure data quality and consistency across such a diverse set of sources is by classifying the data into well-defined categories as well as well-defined processing. So CPI organizes data into two main types, the primary data and the secondary data, each one with own two subcategories. And these classifications are based on the granularity of the data itself rather on the quality of the provider or the source. On the left side, the primary data consists of detailed financial flows where project or institutional level information is available. And on the right side, secondary data, in contrast, it provides a higher level perspective, often relying on benchmark or market sizing data to complement and validate analysis. As the granularity of the available data decreases, more sophisticated methodologies become necessary. And as we expand the scope of climate finance tracking by applying evidence-based calculations to reputable sources, particularly in sectors where project level data is not available. So regardless of the data category, all data undergoes rigorous checks for issues such as double counting and is subject to gap filling procedures, which we will talk about in the next section. At the bottom of the image, you can see a simplified project level row, providing an example of how a treated data source will look like in its final form, now part of the centralized GLCF dataset. So building on our approach to classifying and collecting data, we can now see the scale of the data set of the underpinning global landscape. On the next slide, our database captures climate finance flows of over 20 million rows of information drawn from 30 different sources. And this includes data on around 100,000 projects tracking a cumulative $10.9 trillion in climate finance across a set of 16,000 institutions for which climate relevant financial flows can be reliably tracked and spanning across cross-cutting sectors and geographies. And at this scale, we inevitably face several challenges. So sources often overlap, leading to duplicate or partial entries, and data comes in heterogeneous formats with many reporting standards. So project descriptions can be also incomplete, institution names inconsistent, and information on sectors, geographies, or financial instruments sometimes is missing. There is also a natural lag in data publication from some of our key sources, and this directly explains one of the most common questions we receive. The question being, why don't you release more updated numbers, right? Or why are your figures more than a year old? And the reason is simple, right? The global landscape can only be as current as the data available from our primary sources. So these challenges, they underscore why our earlier tracking principles, data classification methodology are critical. They allow us to synthesize, clean, and systematically validate these massive and complex data sets and ensure that the analysis is robust, credible, despite the scale and diversity of inputs. And this work is made possible by our research team, leading on our methodology development, and on our data science team, which leads on the processing, integration, and quality assurance of the data, turning millions of raw entries into insights for the global landscape. I'm going to hand over now the presentation to our data science lead, Jake, to go more into detail regarding our data processing.
Thanks, Petro. Next slide, please. So as just mentioned, the Global Landscape of Climate Finance database is a combination of around 30 data sources that provide investment value. So this is real-world data that is often messy or lacking in the information that we require for the global landscape. And we utilize multiple techniques to turn these heterogeneous data sources into reliable insights. So the first and most obvious is standardization. So this is turning data into standardized versions that Varun was talking about earlier. So institution names, country names, financial institution instrument names, all of these are aligned with CPI standards, and all investment flows are tagged according to the global landscape climate solution taxonomy that Varun was also talking about earlier. So related to this, we also use AI and machine learning to augment existing data. So for example, adaptation finance is generally not tagged as such, particularly in the private sector. And so we use an LLM-based model to determine the adaptation likelihood of projects using their project name and description. As well as this, and as well as the 30 data sources that provide investment information, we also have a multitude of ancillary data that we compile. So these are things like the gearing ratios for an investment of a particular climate solution in a particular market, or the price point of EV models in a market, or the ownership structure of multilateral institutions. All of this is used to fill in the gaps that we have in the raw data sources. And then finally, each data source is run through automated validation and double counting checks. And this can be sort of looking across different data sources to check strings to see if the project names are in both, or we can look at the institution value and compare across data sources to make sure that we're not double counting. And all of this is implemented within our cloud-based infrastructure that allows us to scale as the size and complexity of our data processing increases. So this diagram shows how we construct the global landscape data in layers. So first we process individual data sources. So this can be primary data or secondary data, as Pedro was just speaking about earlier. Each processing is bespoke to a data source. And this primary project level data ranges from publicly available data sets, such as the OECD climate-related development finance, to private platforms like IJ Global or Luxembourg Green Exchange, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, etc. And then when primary data does not cover the full scope of a sector, we fill in these gaps via the secondary data, which is top-down, bottom-up, top-down or bottom-up benchmarking and market sizing. And then to ensure all of this has been processed correctly, each data source is run through its own automated validation and checked against third-party benchmarks. This data is then combined into individual sectoral databases. So each of these are essentially a standalone database. And the reason we do this is to allow us to account for sector-specific nuances, ascertain data availability for that sector, while also making it easier for us to identify and correct potential double counting issues as we combine these data sources. And it allows us to apply an additional layer of external third-party benchmarking validation. Following this, all of these sector databases are combined to create a global landscape, a sort of unified global landscape of climate finance, which is, again, subjected to validation checks and double counting checks. So just to run through a couple of examples of how we do this and what we mean by primary data. So CPI prioritizes project level granularity, and though many data sources contain incomplete or though many data sources sort of incomplete or contain partially aggregated information. So to address this, we have the methodologies that Pedro was talking about earlier that fill in, that allow us to fill in this missing information while maintaining the integrity of the data. These methodologies are guided by the principles, as outlined earlier, and are also in the methodology reports, and we review them every year to reflect evolving data standards or improved approaches or improved data availability. So to provide an example for primary data, much of the energy systems data we use has missing or incomplete investment value, but contains much better information on the megawatt capacity of projects. So to infer the total investments, we use a database that we compile that draws on multiple sources for capacity multipliers for specific technologies in specific markets. And this follows a tiered approach meaning we're not reliant on a single provider. I won't go through this entire slide, but you can see that it follows a sort of hierarchical approach. So, IRENA is considered a very reliable data source by us. If we can, we'll use their country level multipliers. If not, we'll default to using data that we generate ourselves from BNEF at the country level. If this isn't accurate enough, then we will default to IRENA regional values, etc., etc. And this is pretty indicative of the layers of estimations for specific values that is applied across the entire global landscape dataset. So from gearing ratios that will infer the debt equity split of project finance, or estimates for the financial instrument using the technology or the actors involved. Next slide, please. And so moving on to secondary data and how we handle that. Due to the paucity of available data, there are technologies or sometimes entire sectors where project level information can't be acquired. And in these instances, we generate data by combining multiple sources to create data that is as detailed as project level information, just typically of a lower granularity. So it's typically at the country level rather than the project level. So for example, project level in the case of electric vehicles would essentially mean every sale of EVs across the world, which is unfortunately beyond us at the moment. And so to fill in this gap, we carry out an extensive market sizing estimation exercise using vehicle sales, which are at the country or regional level. We include public subsidies and coupled with estimates on research on vehicle prices in various different markets, the loan to value ratio of those markets, so figuring out how much is debt, how much is equity from that, the corporate versus household purchase ratios in each individual market, etc. So if we combine all this information, then we can create a data set that is as detailed and granular as the project level data that we use for other sources. So I'll now hand over back to Sasha, who will walk us through how global landscape data is used.
Thanks very much, Jake. Sorry, slow on meeting. If we could go to the next slide, Jana, that would be great. Perfect, thanks. So I think it's also very interesting thinking about how we go from the millions of rows of data that we talked about to what we see in the reports, and also how CPI interacts with climate finance more widely. So the way that we do that is that we have analysts that then take all the data, they pull out key messages from the trends and the dynamics that we observe, but then we also contextualize these messages by drawing on CPI's deep expertise across a high number of areas. So that might be adaptation, private capital mobilization, international climate finance architecture reform. And we use this wider knowledge to contextualize some of the trends that we see and relate them to what's happening in the wider world. We've also been thinking about how we can make our data more accessible and more widely available. And that means still producing our reports, but extending that to some other formats. So you've got a still here in this slide of our GLCF climate finance dashboard. But I would really encourage you to go onto the website. We'll provide the link a little bit later, and really play with it and explore this and see how this format does kind of allow to have wider use of the data and really take all the work that we've done in producing this data set and then apply it to your own work, your own investment decisions, your own understanding of climate finance. So this is a tool that is relatively new for us. We're doing it across lots of different areas of CPI work, and we'll continually update the data that's in this so that it really reflects the latest work that CPI has done on the global landscape. And if we could go to the next slide, please, Jana. Another way that we take our data beyond our reports is by working closely with a number of fantastic partners to help feed into wider work and feed into discussions that are happening across the climate landscape, but also finance discussions, legal discussions, policy communities. And the names that are on here and the logos that are on here are really just a small selection of some of the different initiatives, institutions, events that we work with to try and make sure that the numbers and the insights that are created under the global landscape don't just sit with CPI, they go out into the wider world and they feed in wherever we do need evidence and insights on climate finance. If you go to the next slide, please, Jana. I think here, again, this is just a small selection of the international climate reports that we feed into, but we help to provide climate finance evidence for the IPCC, the UNFCCC, and most recently, the Circle of Finance Ministers back into Belém report. But in general, we'll contribute to climate finance discussions that happen in both formal multilateral discussions and wider discussions that happen outside of those meetings and summits and processes. If we go to the next, Jana, I think it's also important to stress that we don't just talk to people who are climate finance experts. We also want to make sure that our data, our insights can be used more widely. And some of that is translating some of the very complex technical work we do into more digestible, accessible messages and trying to engage in public discussions on climate and climate finance. So here, again, it's a smaller selection of some of the media partners that we work with or that use our work to inform the reporting or messaging they do. But it's something that we think about, not just the people who are already well versed in climate finance, but also the people who want to know more. If you can then go to the next slide. I'd like to close out the webinar by just talking about some of the things that we have coming next for the global landscape and its methodology. I think, as you would have seen from everything that my colleagues have presented so far, it's something that we're always building on and improving and adding new areas. And the global landscape methodology is something that is never closed. It's constantly being discussed at CPI. So a highlight of some of the things that are coming up, we're updating the data dashboard for January 2026, and that will then have historical data, which will hopefully be a great improvement that will really improve the user experience for lots of people that we know are already using the dashboard. It will allow you to compare between different years, which is really helpful for them thinking about trends, dynamics in the data. So that will be a great update at the start of next year. In terms of the next iteration of the global landscape, we'll be publishing the 2026 version in early summer next year towards the end of Q2. And that will be covering 2024 climate finance data in full. And we'll also have some early insights on 2025 climate finance as far as the data allows us to do that. And again, there'll be updated methodological improvements, which we'll detail when we release that report. We'll also have a number of sectoral, thematic, regional reports that draw on the global landscape data to provide deep dives into certain areas. So you may be familiar with lots of our other reports. In the Q&A, some people have mentioned things like the Africa landscape of climate finance. These things all work off the global landscape data set and then build in additional insights that are specific to those areas. So we'll continue to release those throughout next year. I also have some useful links there, but a couple of people have asked, we'll be publishing the presentation, we'll be publishing the recording, and all of these links and slides will be available so that people can refer back to them after this cool webinar. If that is all okay, I'm now going to transfer over to the Q&A portion of the webinar. Please do keep asking questions. We'll answer some of them in chat and some of them live with our speakers. So the first one I'm going to hand over to Pedro for. And Pedro, would you be able to answer the question that we have on if there are data additions and methodological changes, how are the trends then comparable across different years?
Thank you, Sasha. Yeah, in a nutshell, the answer is yes, because CPI makes the effort to retroactively update any changes in methodology or new data sources to our whole historical data. You can see in our historical reports also every year the highlights of these new methodologies improvements or the new data sources we include. Of course, there are sometimes due to timeline restrictions or capacity restrictions, cases in where data sources or new methodologies are not fully retroactively updated depending on an edition of the report. And we make sure to prioritize the retroactive update for the most important ones. And sometimes we need to leave the more marginal changes out of the update, but we always make sure that in the next edition, everything's incorporated later on. So yeah, in a nutshell, it's they are comparable with sometimes some marginal changes over the next report of the next year. But yeah, that's the answer to the question.
Thanks very much, Pedro.
Yeah.
I'm now going to hand over to Varun. And someone has asked, as you synthesize data from various sources in climate finance, what differences have you observed in how data is categorized? And how do these differences in categorization and the varying definitions that stem from them impact progress in this field? Varun is our taxonomy expert, so he's the right person to answer this question.
Thank you, Sasha, for the question. Yeah, I think as rightly pointed out, one of the key challenges is the variation in what other organizations provide in terms of our data sources as to what they classify as climate finance, as well as to what level of granularity they provide our data. So is it at solution level, or is it at subsector level, or is it even beyond solution with a clear example of what the activity is? But we need to understand here that many of our data source providers have different incentives in terms of how they present their data. And in terms of what we look at in our data collection process, each of the data providers climate tag their data, and how we process is that we use reference tables to then allocate them onto the detailed taxonomy that we have. And we do not take into consideration all the solutions that they may have if it doesn't fit what we've classified as climate finance. And where there may be discrepancies, for example, on the solutions or actors or instruments, we use desk-based research to supplement that data. And I want to highlight here that there are lots of national taxonomies coming out, as well as private sector taxonomies that have come out, and each with different interests. We present a global climate finance database, so what might be considered relevant for climate finance in Vietnam might be quite different to what it might be in the UK here. So whilst we understand there's a move towards harmonization, we should also think about the fact that it might be quite difficult to coordinate, and so we play that role in trying to standardize the data.
Thanks very much, Varun. I'm now going to hand over to Jake. So someone's asked about whether what your team is doing, so the data science team, is cleaning and preparing the data so that the analysts can then use it, or do you guys also do some analysis and derive insights from that?
Thanks, Sasha. Yeah, that's pretty much it. We are the data team is kind of the grunt work of the data creation. But I think it's important to note that the code that we write is essentially a reflection of the methodology documentation that everyone is contributing to across the global landscape team. So yes, we're doing more of the data creation. The analysis is more done by the rest of the research team. There are sort of aspects within the workflow that we contribute to, like we might help creating cuts of the data that the analysts can then use. But primarily the data team is really there to create the data sets and ensure the sort of accuracy and the quality of it.
Thanks so much, Jake. And we've got another question which I'm actually going to answer. So someone's asked, as we identify gaps in data coverage, do we typically share recommendations with our source institutions on how they can strengthen their data collection and reporting? And it'd be great to understand how this feedback loop works on our side. So the answer on this is yes, we very much do this. I think it's a mixture of our expertise and also a level of self-interest, because obviously we want there to be better climate finance data out there, both because we think it's important and because it makes our lives easier. I might hand over to Jake after I've spoken to talk a bit more about how we work with some of the more private finance focused data sets that we have, and how we engage with the people that kind of create those and manage those, to talk about our needs for those and how we use them. But I'm primarily focused on the public finance tracking side. And we do quite a lot of work with different institutions to try and make sure that there's as much consensus on climate finance tracking as possible, that high quality methodologies are in place. There is a huge range of capacity across the different organizations that monitor, report, track climate finance. And I think part of what we do is also try and contribute to best practice, and then work with some of the institutions that capacity gaps and really talk about what can be done and what the practical steps are to tracking climate finance. So in particular, myself and some of my team work with the IDFC, the International Development Finance Hub, to work with some of their institutions to implement the climate finance methodologies that they've all agreed to. I think there's one thing to have the methodologies available, and then it's another thing to translate that into what an individual financial institution does as they look at across their financing and decide how to categorize it. So we've got some guidance that we've published online, which is very in-depth and practical. And I can link you to that as an example of some of the work we do to kind of strengthen that feedback loop. And I would say it definitely helps working with the data to help others understand what the point of the process is and what tracking and reporting climate finance allows others to do. I'll hand over to Jake to maybe talk to some of the other bigger data sets that we use.
Yeah, the short answer is no. Like, we don't have a great deal of influence on the private sector data sets that we ingest. There's only so much that we can ask them to add into their data. But yeah, those data sets are they're not just used for climate, or they're certainly not just used for the global landscape of climate finance. So our ability to influence them and ask for additional data that we would find useful is somewhat limited. But God knows we try. Yep.
Perfect. Thanks, Jake. We've got another question around what we're doing on adaptation finance. So this is again something that we are constantly looking at. I think that if you look at our global landscape from last year, there are some descriptions of some of the adaptation specific challenges that we have in tracking climate finance. And I think with adaptation, there are a few areas that are very tricky around definitions for reporting institutions, and then coverage of the data, and all of those kind of feed into the difficulties with aggregating figures for it. So something that we're focused on is trying to look at different sources that we can incorporate into the global landscape. I think on the public finance side, there's lots to do on helping institutions report adaptation and understand how to track adaptation financing in their own portfolios. But on the private finance side, it's something that we are always wanting to improve and strengthen our capture of what's happening out there. I think there are some areas like infrastructure, household spending, where we think there is more that we can do, but there is no one simple way to extracting that data from the wider world and putting a definitive figure on it. So we both work on that internally, but also try and engage with others who are working on those issues to try and forge a way forward to get the best data out there to track what's happening in those areas. We always remain open to discussing that with other people who are working on those areas. And just looking at the other questions, we have one question on US climate finance and reporting. I would say that we don't want to prejudge anything that happens. So far, we've been able to use reported data, and there haven't been disruptions yet. So I think we work with the data that has come out so far. As we've said, this year we've been working with 2023 climate finance data. Next year we'll be working with 2024 climate finance data. So yeah, we are always working with a slight lag on the data that we use because of when it's reported. We also have a question on how inflation is adjusted for. Pedro, I might bring you in to talk through that because we obviously have ways of doing that in our data set.
Yeah. On the inflation side, we try to account for inflation in specific cases where we deem it more necessary, depending on sector solution. But we don't have a general approach of it. We don't do just centralize inflation rate for this correction of prices. We basically do it case by case, depending on the necessity of our assessment. And yeah, also depending on different tracking exercises we do besides the global landscape, be it perhaps a more granular exercise on a specific country, for example, we take a more well-established approach for how to correct by inflation.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Pedro. I think we're coming to the end of our webinar. We'll try and answer any remaining questions in the chat. But for now, I might hand over back to Darshan to close us for the webinar. And thanks everyone for attending and for your great questions.
Thanks, Sasha. Before I close, which I will do very shortly, it's really valuable to have the questions from those who joined the webinar. We are, as a team, constantly thinking about how we can evolve the products that we produce. I think those questions of, how do we interrelate with the ecosystem, I think are key for us and often for our funders. So the impact that we have, let me talk about three or four specific groups. The impact we actually have on other non-profit organizations and think tanks is definitely an area where we can exert influence. We also are in quite close contact with a number of coalitions, both on the private and public side. Sasha referred to the International Development Finance Club. We're also in coordination with a number of the private financial institution coalitions on this type of data, but also on our dedicated private financial institution tracking data as well. And my read of it is that they are interested and motivated to understand what nonprofits like us do, how we synthesize the data, what metrics and indicators we focus on. And it does influence what type of information they put out there. But sometimes it can take time, and it can be through extended degrees, right? So a financial institution, private one, won't say, hey, look, we've modified our reporting, but they will take our insights as well as a number of others into account as they're thinking through how to navigate tracking of finance of all different types. And then the last group I'll talk about is the data providers themselves, right, which can be both private, the likes of MSCI, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and Bloomberg Terminals, or they can be public, like the development finance institutions or the MDBs. And they all have a different set of incentives, but they're also ones that we are often in discussion with about what our approach is, together with organizations like IEA, the International Energy Agency, and the high-level panels which function in this space, partly to triangulate our data and figures and content that they're also putting out there. With that, I'll draw us to a close. I want to thank everyone on my team who presented today. I want to thank all of you who joined. I think you've seen that the work is never static. In 2026, we'll push even further on strengthening our methods. I think there were some questions on adaptation. We're acutely aware that as it becomes clearer that we will spend more time over safe temperature trajectories, adaptation, and I think it was referenced in the questions, loss and damage will be pertinent and important issues to resolve. And we think we've got a role to play on providing some insights and some data-based evidence around how societies are preparing for that. Your feedback, your collaboration, a big part of what makes this possible. Please do interact with us on our website. Reach out to us individually through some of the contact details you'll find there. I wish you all a productive rest of the year as we go through December, and we look forward to working with many of you again, or for the first time in 2026. Thank you very much for joining us.